Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you guys are having a great Holy Week. We're just a few days away from Easter, and we're continuing with our series of days in the wilderness, and we're on our third episode. Now, since Easter is just a couple days away, today's episode is going to focus on the final hours of the life of Jesus. So, our episode is entitled God on a Cross. So, we're really looking forward to celebrating Easter this year, but the way it works with Easter is you don't have an Easter unless you first have the cross. You don't have the resurrection of Jesus unless you first have his death. So today's lesson might be a little bit more heavy, but it's necessary for us to really appreciate the fullness of what's going on with the Easter holiday. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at three of the events of the final few hours of Jesus's life, some of the three major events that he went through, and the isolation that he felt. So again, our theme for this series is solitude and isolation and people that are separated out for some reason or another to learn something that God has to teach them. So Jesus himself went through that in his final moments, and we're going to see that by looking at three different events from his final hours with us. And the first of those takes place in a garden by the name of Gethsemane. So Gethsemane was a garden on a hillside just a little bit outside of Jerusalem. And Jesus, after his Last Supper, after his final meal with his disciples, takes them out to this garden to pray. And this garden had a lot of olive trees. In fact, if you go there today, people say that some of those olive trees you'll see were the very same olive trees still alive 2,000 years ago when Jesus and his disciples walked among them. So he goes and he takes the disciples there to pray. And specifically, he takes three of them to be a little bit closer to him. And those three are Peter, James, and John. And he takes them and says, guys, I want you to keep watch. I want you to keep awake. And I'm going to just go a stone's throw away. And I'm going to pray to God. I'm going to pray to my Father. And I want you guys to keep awake. You have just that one job. And so Jesus goes away and he begins to pray. And his prayer is very intense, and he knows what's coming, and he knows the intensity of all the struggle that he's going through. And he prays to God, he prays to his Father and says, Father, if there's any other way that this doesn't have to happen, please let this pass from me. But at the end of the prayer, he says, but if it has to, may your will be done. And unfortunately, when he comes back to see his disciples, he catches them sleeping. And this happens not only once, not only twice, but it happens actually three times total. Jesus goes and prays, and he comes back, and they're asleep, and he wakes them up, and he says, guys, and just please, just one thing I'm asking of you. And he goes away to pray again, and they're asleep. And after the third time, Jesus is unfortunately taken away and arrested, and all of his disciples are scattered. So we can see in this section that Jesus was undergoing really tremendous psychological and emotional isolation. He felt emotionally very saddened, very sorrowful. The Bible says he was sorrowful to the point of death. It's also recorded that he was sweating so intensely that his sweat became drops of blood. So he was experiencing really intense inner turmoil. And I hope by the end of this lesson, you guys can see that Jesus is experiencing different kinds of stress and isolation and feeling kind of alone, like ways we might have felt at different points in our lives, or maybe ways we're even feeling now. So after Jesus is arrested and taken away, he's brought to trial. He's basically brought to a few places, but he ends up before Pontius Pilate, who is the name of a local Roman governor that the Jews had to bring someone like that before to put on trial, and because they wanted Jesus to be executed. So for here, you'll find a couple different passages that we look to, and the first of those is going to be John chapter 18. So Pilate doesn't really believe that Jesus is guilty. He thinks he's innocent. He doesn't see what the real harm in what he was doing. Jesus was teaching and he was healing people. Pilate didn't see anything wrong with that. But Pilate also was worried about the rebellion of the Jewish people and how that would make him look in the eyes of Rome and in the eyes of Caesar. So Pilate tries a few different things to calm the Jewish people. He takes Jesus and he has him beaten and whipped and flogged, and thinking that that might do something, he offers to pardon Jesus, or he gives the Jews a choice between Jesus and this criminal, an insurrectionist, a rebel by the name of Barabbas. And he says, you guys can have Jesus or you guys can have Barabbas for me to pardon. Which one do you want me to pardon? And they actually say, give us Barabbas. We don't want Jesus pardoned. We want him dead. So at the very end of that, Pilate basically has this final kind of dialogue with Jesus. And we're going to read just a little portion of that before he basically brings Jesus back out before the people, which you see in this image here. But in that final dialogue, he is speaking with Jesus, and in John chapter 18, Pilate begins by saying this. Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" After that he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews. And that's sort of represented by this painting you see here on the screen, where Pilate famously says, "Behold the man," and he shows them Jesus to the Jews. And at that point, he basically gives him over to be crucified. But one thing that I want you guys to take away from this little section is, for Pilate's perspective, Pilate's question of what is truth to Jesus was not a sincere one. So you may think that he was asking because he wanted to know the answer, but the fact that he didn't is revealed by the next line, where it says he asked that question and then he just walks out on Jesus. So he's not a sincere questioner. He didn't really want to know who Jesus was or whether he spoke the truth. He just wanted the people to be quiet and things under control. And so at the end of the day, he was willing to let Jesus be sacrificed for that, and rather than deeply concerned himself for what the truth of life was. So as Jesus is undergoing this, there's a kind of a parallel scene that's going on. And this parallel scene is found in Matthew 26. So basically, Peter has managed to sneak into the forecourt to try and listen in and hear what's going on with the interrogation of Jesus and the trial and all this kind of stuff. And there's a few people that end up recognizing Peter. So I'm going to read this little section here that we have, and we're going to see how it ends up for Peter himself. And as I do so, keep an eye on this image, because this basically kind of represents what we're going to be reading. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before them all, saying, "I do not know what you mean." And when he went out to the entrance, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then he began to invoke a curse upon himself, and to swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. So it's a really sad moment for Peter, as well as for Jesus. Now, in some of the other Gospels, it actually says not just that Peter remembered what Jesus said, but it actually says that at that moment, Jesus turned and looked at Peter. So that's what you saw in that image there. If you look in the background, if we go back to it, that Jesus is being paraded out. He's just been condemned and he is being taken away to be executed. And he glances over right at that moment where you see the rooster crowing and the servant girls pointing at Peter. And it must have been a pretty shameful moment. Peter went out and wept bitterly. He had betrayed Jesus. He was so confident that he wouldn't. And he was the one who said he would stick with Jesus to the end. He was going to be Jesus's closest friend. And yet this was, in the moment of trial, he was the one who denied him. And all it took was a few servant girls asking him whether or not he was a disciple for him to kind of break. So you see in this moment, unlike the kind of psychological inner emotional turmoil that Jesus went through in the Garden of Gethsemane, you see that this is a very social and relational isolation that Jesus experiences. He's betrayed by his friends, and society is now scorning him and rebuking him and saying, "We don't want you. We don't even want you alive." So the final moment, of course, that we're going to look at is the cross itself. So after Jesus is betrayed and put on trial, he's taken out, and he's taken out to be crucified. And again, you'll see some passages here that are going to reflect some of the things that we're going to be looking at. Now, Jesus is crucified, and I don't need to go into too much detail about the crucifixion. You probably have heard it from me or from others. That's a terrible way to die, and it's a very painful way, and it's a slow way to die. And yet, there's some really powerful moments that even amidst all of that physical struggle and that spiritual struggle that he was experiencing on the cross, he still found it. Jesus still found it within himself to pray for the people that were killing him as they were doing it. And so from Luke, you find this passage where he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And imagine that, just to be able to pray for forgiveness for the people that are killing you, that are actually driving the nails into your hands and that are spitting on you and mocking you. And yet Jesus was able to do that. So Jesus' struggle on the cross was not just a physical one. It was a profoundly spiritual one too, because he's tempted to hate these people. He's tempted to, if you had the power of God and someone was doing this to you, maybe you'd want to just destroy them all on the spot or call down lightning on them or something like that. And Jesus withheld his miraculous power, and he found it in his heart to actually pray for those people as they were killing him. And just as a quick note, this event of the crucifixion is sort of seen as a fulfillment of a lot of Old Testament prophecies. But one in particular is very interesting, and this comes from the book of Isaiah, and Isaiah chapter 53. Now, Isaiah was a prophet, and Isaiah writes about this future figure, the Messiah figure that's going to come, and he's going to bear this terrible burden and this terrible punishment, but it's going to be a redemptive one for all of us. And in Isaiah chapter 53, it says this: "Surely he," this suffering servant, this Messiah figure, "has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that brought us peace. And with his wounds we are healed." So that's a very powerful passage and a very powerful setting. And again, we're reminded now that Jesus underwent physical pain and then that intense physical isolation as his very spirit was taken from his body, and that spiritual struggle as well of feeling spiritually separated. He actually cries out from the cross at one point. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Because he was feeling all the weight of sin and all the isolation of the world and that brokenness was being put on his shoulders in that moment. So as we kind of come back and wrap up, guys, and take a step out of this, again, I want us to remember that this has been maybe a heavy lesson, but it's a necessary one, because we don't appreciate what the resurrection of Jesus means unless we know that Jesus died and why he died. And I hope that you guys are doing well, but I also hope that in our moments of struggle, we know that Jesus went through every kind of isolation, every kind of sense of separation that we could experience, whether it's relational, social, emotional, psychological, physical, or spiritual. So with that being said, guys, I want to let you know that, again, we're praying for you. We're hoping you're all doing well during this shelter in place, and remind you that you can find us on Facebook at Revolution Student Ministries, or on Instagram at rev.studentministries as well. So we're trying to be posting quite often, especially during this quarantine time. And we hope you guys have a wonderful Easter. We're looking forward to a follow-up lesson where we'll talk more positively on the resurrection. So keep tuned for that. And until then, keep well. God be with you all. And we love you very much.